it is a real pleasure to be able to present to you all about this new report that is now available called Capturing the Sun, a roadmap for navigating data access challenges and auto-populating solar home sale listings. This has been a multi-year project that culminates in this report and will also hopefully be incentive and fodder for continuing work in this area. I'm Ben Hohen. I'm a research scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and I am joined by some esteemed individuals, thought leaders in this area that work around the country and locally. We have Laura Stuckel, who's a realtor. She served as the taskmaster and the cat herder of this project, doing most of the heavy lifting and originally drafting the roadmap. She has a deep knowledge and understanding of the people and the systems involved in the real estate world, and we're very glad to have her as part of this project. Also on the phone with us is Craig Foley, who's also a realtor and an educator, and he really helped us translate what it means to list a home, be involved in a high-performance property during that transaction process, and how to make our roadmap fit with those processes. Sandy Adamatis is also a co-author. I'm not sure she's going to be joining us today. She had a personal emergency she had to deal with, but hopefully she'll be on later on when we get into kind of an open-ended set of questions for the panel. And then also we have Laura Parsons on the phone. She helped us. She's from the Center for Sustainable Energy in California and helped us deeply understand the reality of data access, especially in California. We'll talk a little bit about that today. And she also led so much of the effort to make the roadmap readable and approachable. So if you like the way the roadmap looks, it's really Laura and her team that made it. Okay, so moving on here, I've given you a little bit of an introduction to acknowledge DOE's support for this work through their Sunshot Initiative. They have had the vision to understand the importance of this work and making sure we can find ways, even though they're going to be difficult, to get data in the hands of those that need it. And not only are they funding this work, but they funded and are funding something called the Orange Button Initiative, which is a national effort to look at how data can be aggregated and standardized and ultimately put into the hands of those that need it too. Finally, one thing to note is we have just a huge team of individuals that participated as contributing individuals, whether they were subject matter experts we reached out to, or those that were on the call and provided feedback when we needed it. And they're all listed in the report. There are too many to note today, but I do urge you to take a look through there. And they're just very helpful, and we couldn't have done it without them. So why are we here? Why does this issue of connecting data with the right people in the real estate process even matter? Well, we've got over 1 million homes currently with solar on them, and that number is growing fast. The thinking is that we might be at 2 million in 2 or 3 years. So we've got lots of solar homes around the country, but they aren't distributed evenly. In some places, we have solar home densities over 20%. And so it becomes pretty difficult for the realtors and the appraisers involved in those processes of selling those homes to not run into solar homes, those that work in those communities. So they need data to do this appropriately. Well, this is only reinforced by the need now, based on some federal guidelines from Fannie Mae and FHA HUD, to name 2, that require individuals that run into homes with solar to appropriately account for those systems. That might be simply saying this system should not be accounted for in the appraised value, or it would be this system should be accounted for in the appraised value, and obviously here's how to do it, or here's the appropriate approach that you might take to value those characteristics. So we've got a growing number of solar homes. We've got higher densities, and we've got guidelines for the appropriate valuation of those systems. But in many cases, those individuals are left scrambling to try to find the data that they need to do those valuations and appropriately market those homes. Big importance. Realtors often don't have expertise and therefore would love that data to be accounted for by others and handed over to them so that they can trust that it's the right data to use. State and local policymakers might have goals on solar deployment in their state, and this might be a drag if it's perceived as a difficult part of the process. And alternatively, it could be something that drives demand if we know that solar homes transact very easily. Similarly, solar industry professionals want to make sure that those homes with their systems are appropriately accounted for. For instance, with the difference between a home that has a third-party owned system, such as a solar system that's leased, or one that's owned by the homeowner, is a big distinction in terms of valuation. And clarifying that early might make the transfer of those homes happen much more efficiently. And finally, we've got MLSs and real estate data aggregators. They serve the customers of the realtors and the appraisers, and those customers are, in a growing sense, needing these data more and more. So to add these data into their system provides value. We think that the roadmap could be useful to all of those parties to better understand what are the roadblocks and how to get around them. The objective today is to cover these three things broadly. We're going to present the key concepts of the roadmap so you can get the most out of it when you read it or you read parts of it. We want to preview the roadmap exercises because that's really the key component of this roadmap. We're giving folks exercises on how to make this happen, make auto-population of solar home characteristics happen in their local community. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the emerging opportunities that we'll be watching, and so should you be watching for in 2017. So this gives you an outline of not only our agenda today, but also the roadmap. So what is the roadmap? The roadmap is not a silver bullet that will allow suddenly solar system characteristics to be populated into multiple listing services, but rather it's a recognition that A, that needs to happen, and B, it's going to be difficult, but here is a pathway for doing it. One of the key components of this roadmap is the enforcement of the idea of auto-population of characteristics. That auto-population, connecting solar data automatically to the MLS through the listing process, is key in terms of understanding where we see that the industry should go. And so this report lays out the pathways and the steps taken to potentially have that happen in local communities. So we're going to step through the basic idea of how the roadmap was put together and why we use that analogy, roadmap. We're going to talk a little bit about the reflections from the road, and what that means is we're going to hear from Laura and Craig and Laura about the local context of San Diego, Massachusetts, and Colorado, where we focused our efforts on and used the roadmap steps to see whether we could actually come to a viable solution that might be considered in those communities. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about what's going to happen post-roadmap, and then open it up for questions and answers. So I think at this point I'm going to hand it over to you, Laura, but before I do, let me just check in with Deborah. Are there any immediate questions we need to address before we move on?
Yes, and we've got one question asking when the DOE report on the value of leased solar systems will be released to the public.
Good question. We have finished the analysis of that report, and he's not referring to the roadmap. That's a separate analysis. And we should be releasing that in the next 30 days. let's say, we would go out with that information on the same mailing list that we notified folks about this. You can also contact me directly, and I can keep you abreast of that release date.
Great, thank you. That's the only question right now.
All right, let me turn it over to Laura Stuckel.
Great. Really happy to be here. It's been an honor to be a part of this project for the past about 15 months or so, and really delighted to be able to be part of the team presenting today. So what I wanted to jump into is that point that Ben brought up. Why did we use the idea of a journey metaphor? What does it mean? And then kind of give you some tips in terms of what to expect so that when you get a hold of it and start paging through, you kind of know what to look for and what to expect. So I think 15, 16 months ago when we started out to do this, we came into it a little bit sort of thinking this was going to be a technical mapping and kind of a roadmap that said you do point A, you get to point B, you get to point C. And what we found is that I think some of that is from the experience that some of us had working with energy efficiency and trying to auto-populate that to the MLS. And energy-efficient features often being hidden in the attics and the walls becomes kind of problematic. So I think there was sort of an expectation that, hey, this is a solar panel, everyone can agree that it's there, this should be a little bit more straightforward. And fairly early on into the process is that it wasn't quite so straightforward as we had hoped. So instead of doing kind of this technical mapping that we were expecting to do, we really were digging in also very much about technology, but also stakeholders, access to the data. So really looking at a lot of different aspects and trying to piece the pieces of the puzzle together. So once we realized it wasn't really a hop in the car and go end up at point C kind of proposition, that it was more a winding journey, and we had to be kind of open-minded, things really did fall together, and I think it's reflected in the document that we've put together. So some things to look for. We really did focus on orientation, so understanding setting the expectations about the journey. I think also, and you'll hear this especially when Craig and Laura Parsons speak later, but also setting the expectation that every journey is going to be a little bit different. The real estate market in every area is different. The solar market in every area is different. How those pieces line up are different. So not only did we design the roadmap so that readers could orient themselves in terms of how to get started, where they fit into the process, but also we provided some tools that help the readers get an orientation to their own particular journey for their market area, whether that be a state example like we had, a county, a metro area, whatever that might be. So one other thing, and I think Ben brought this up, but today we're really presenting what we learned and observed and an organized way to think about it. But as Ben said, we don't quite have the answer key yet, but what we do have is a roadmap that's really set up for you to follow the path that our extended team went on, and it's set up with different types of tools and content at each point so that you really can understand the key concepts and start to dig in around what that means for you locally. So in addition to the orientation, that's the first bullet on this slide here, for each topic area, we sort of went through 4 layers for the same topic. So we introduced the topic, we introduced some tools that readers could use to assess what that means to them in their local area, and again, that could be a metro area, it could be a city, it could be a state. Then we offered the reflections of our 3 case study areas, so the state of Massachusetts, the state of Colorado, and then San Diego County. And it's just, in each of them, they're so different, but I think they really offer some great concrete examples. And so not only do they kind of help the reader process what's possible, but help you also by providing 3 really great and different examples as kind of a launching off point to think about what's happening in your own market. Then, as Ben also mentioned, there's exercises. So there's a web-based tool. Either you can print it out or it's a web-based tool. And for each of those assessment points, you can go through and start to collect the same information for your area. We hope that it will become a tool that teams can use. A lot of this involves reaching across industries. So if solar advocates are reaching out to real estate experts, or legal experts are reaching out to solar advocates, or whatever that might be, that these exercises might be kind of a collaboration tool as well. And then in key areas, we also provided resources to go to for more information. So that sets up a general orientation to how the report was established. And then now let me move on and talk about some of the key concepts. So what we want to help you on this call do is to go from the idea of auto-populating solar data to the real estate listing. So the idea of matching that solar information and having it automatically appear when that home comes up for sale. So how do we get from the idea of that to a pathway? And what we kept coming back to is that there's four assessment areas that kept coming up over and over. So who are the navigators? Who are the folks that you want? If this is a journey, who are the folks that you want in the car taking the journey with you? And then 3 different types of assessment. An assessment of the landscape. And we really found that it's a 2-part assessment. So it's very much about what is the solar industry like in a given market, but also what is the real estate market like, and what are the players involved? What are the processes involved? What are the key things to think about? And then the third point is understanding the solar data. So what is important when you're talking about describing a solar system for residential, and then what's most valuable to the multiple listing service, to the real estate transaction, to the appraisers? So we have a good section on that. And then the fourth real key assessment was around, okay, so we know what the solar data target is. We know what information we want to go after. Who holds that information? Do they know anything? Have they been thinking about strategies to bring this to the real estate market? Where are they in terms of, is that information public? If it's not public, is it something that could be public? So there's a lot of information. Is it information that could be shared with the real estate industry? So we offer some advice on how to dig in around that topic. From the standpoint, 2 of those points, point number 1 on the navigators and point number 3 about the solar data, in those 2 cases, it was a little bit more straightforward in terms of what the targets were there. So I'll take those first, and then we'll dig in a little bit. Laura and Craig are going to offer some perspective around how you go about assessing the landscape, and then Ben will walk us through some of the twists and turns and forks in the road we started to see around data access. So let me cover first the more straightforward one. So first, the navigators. Who are the folks you want in the car for this journey? And so the one that really emerged was this idea of a journey leader. And we had quite a bit of conversation in terms of really trying to define in the roadmap, what is a journey leader? How do you find them? What do they look like? What do they do? And what we realized is that every journey is unique, and every journey leader will be unique. For the most part, the consensus we came to is that a journey leader can come really from any stakeholder group. It could be a journey leader that comes from the real estate industry, as a solar advocate, as a regulatory advocate. And so it doesn't quite matter so much where they come from, but more the criteria, the key criteria is around really having a vision and a long-term vision to be able to sustain the conversations, bring partners together, and either having access to budget directly or to know how to fundraise to manage a journey. That's, not to make it sound overwhelming. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, and so someone that has that type of perspective. So there's some great information in the setup around what the journey leader looks like. And perhaps it's an initiative that's shared across industries or across partners, that sort of thing. So hopefully by signing up and being on this call, it might be a sign that you're a potential journey leader or the type of person that can identify who that strong journey leader might be in your market. So hopefully that will be a resource for you folks on the phone to figure out how maybe possibly you can step into that role or your organization, or how you can find that journey leader in your market. The other really key navigator that came out to us was what we call data record holders. And Ben is going to talk a little bit more about the different types of data. And what we found is that the organization that holds that data is different depending on the type of data. In some cases, like a permitting office that issues a permit when a solar system is installed, they may be so far removed from the real estate transaction, they're not even thinking about it. So in some cases, there are kind of layers to go through to get to who these data record holders are. Some of them might need more background to understand the value proposition of making this data available, how it can help really advance and jumpstart the interest in the residential field around solar, and really make that transaction easier when you're selling those homes. So we found that data record holders could range from a utility to, like I said, a permit provider. And Ben will talk a little bit more about that. So, and we also have some exercises in terms of being able to understand better who those data records holders are and help understanding what's their orientation to this journey. Do they even know about it? Is it something they might be receptive to, or what are some tools to help engage them? And then some of the other important partners that have to fall into place once that journey leader and those record holders are identified is the idea of data aggregators. And in that case, that was really interesting. In many cases, these data aggregators already exist. It's just maybe that they don't have, that they're not either, they either are focused on aggregating solar data, or they're possibly aggregating real estate data, but not necessarily bridging from one area to the other. So in the multiple listing service industry, there are tax vendors that provide data to MLS providers. There are public record aggregators, there are permit aggregators, there are solar aggregators. So that was kind of an interesting one to look at. We're hoping that in the future there might be a little bit more of a stronger business case for some of those existing aggregators to push into the solar space and pursue that data. So that's kind of something that we hope that there might be more promise in the years to come in terms of those data aggregators really getting more into the solar space. The bridge partners term we used for the really kind of to broadly cover the real estate industry. There's so many different facets to that industry, and it's kind of nice as I'm looking at the log of who's on the phone. I know that there's a lot of folks that represent those different areas. So there's MLS providers, there's their vendors, there are the brokers that belong to boards of realtors, and sometimes those boards of realtors own the MLS. There are appraisers. And so those bridge partners we found kind of popped in and out of the journey along the way and played different roles at different times, but yet were someone that you really want to engage from start to finish so they really feel like they're part of the process. And there's lots of great information, particularly from our case study areas, in terms of how those bridge partners look a little different depending on different markets that you're in. And then finally, the regulatory champions. So some of this data is somewhat under a public purview. So anytime there's a regulatory champion that comes in and understands, where they're motivated to really push solar and they see some opportunities through their means to be able to promote it, that's always a bonus to have some kind of regulatory champion on board. So we covered that in the roadmap as well. So next, let me move on and talk about the solar data targets, and then we'll pass on and talk a little bit about the pieces that kind of vary depending on what markets that you're in. But in terms of the solar data, I'm going to talk about the Real Estate Standards Organization. First, for those on the phone, to give a little bit of a background about who they are and why they are important, and then in that blue box, go into a little bit about the overlap of data. And luckily, you see on the right-hand side, it's a relatively short and manageable list, which we're really pleased about. So let me start on the left side first. The Real Estate Standards Organization is a trade group that serves to provide standards for the MLS industry. And if you love a site like Trulia or Zillow or Realtor.com, behind the scenes with consumers, RESO is really the reason that kind of data sharing can happen at a broad level. There's also great benefit for MLSs in terms of how they're sharing data with their brokerages and their users. And so behind the scenes, the standards that the Real Estate Standards Organization manages is what makes that possible. One of the many good things that they provide to the industry is a data dictionary. As of July 2016, they are up to version 1.5, and we're thrilled that they were part of this process from very early on and throughout the process of this roadmap. And as a result of being part of the process, they were able to look at the fields that we were zeroing in on and incorporate those fields into their data dictionary release as of July. So that's a first big step. And then the other part is that they are going through a certification process, and every year a handful of fields comes online, and MLSs are required to adopt those fields if they're going to offer them, do them in a standard way according to the data dictionary. And so not only did the Real Estate Standards Organization look to the fields that we were zeroing in on as a part of this process and incorporate them into their data dictionary, they also flag them so that effective January 1st of 2018, when an MLS that is owned by a board of realtors offers solar fields, they are obligated to offer them according to a standard description that's provided in the data dictionary. So it's really exciting that it creates a standard scale no matter where you are around the country, where vendors and those data aggregators can have the same set of fields, whether they're collecting that data in Albuquerque, New Mexico, or Springfield, Illinois. So we really appreciate their part in the developing the roadmap, but also using that as a launching off point to make an update to their data dictionary. So that brings me to the right-hand side, the box there. The good news is that there's really a very manageable set of fields that are really an overlap in terms of how you describe a solar system and what's of importance to the multiple listing service and getting that incorporated into the transaction. So the fields really zero in around two big questions. Who owns the system, and how does it add value to the transaction? And so you see in that list, if you start and we can do an address match and say that this solar system matches to this multiple listing service address, we can start there. And then from there, the fields that RISO zeroed in on were around who owns the system, that second bullet, what's the size of the system, and they call it a power production size field, what year was it installed, the power production year field, and then what is the actual or estimated annual system output, and they call that the power production annual field. So we're really thrilled. There's much more detail in the roadmap, and there's even an appendix for software vendors at MLSs that want to program these fields that is included. And I know Amanda Stinton is on the line, and so there's some conversation about how to make that piece. Amanda Stinton with the National Association of Realtors, but even looking at ways to make that set of fields even more accessible so more and more MLSs can implement them and realtors and appraisers understand what they are and how to put good data into them. So on those pieces, we had some really good targets in terms of the Navigators and the solar data, and so we're really excited about those as kind of the North Star of our journey. And then the next two pieces, as we move on, understanding the landscape and then understanding how to access data, I will pass off first to Craig Foley to talk about how in the state of Massachusetts they went about understanding the landscape.
Thanks, Laura. Hi, everybody. My name is Craig Foley. I'm a real estate agent, broker, and real estate educator inside Greater Boston. That map that you see of Massachusetts on the left is a percentage map of the number of solar PV installations in our state. We have less population in the western side of our state, so that looks red. If you were to look at total number of solar PV installations in the state, it would be very red inside the Greater Boston area where I practice real estate. It's amazing, whichever way you look at the map, how quickly solar PV has blossomed in our state. In late 2008, early 2009, Green Communities Act was passed. That's Deval Patrick's one of his signature pieces of legislation to really support the solar PV marketplace. At that point, we had 2 to 3 megawatts of installed solar PV in the entire state. We set a pretty lofty goal to get to 400 megawatts by 2017. We reached that goal much faster than we anticipated. I think it was May 2013 when we reached that goal. A new goal was set to get to 1,600 megawatts of installed solar PV in the state by 2020. We reached that goal this last year. So this is emerging much faster than anybody anticipated in our state. There's no question about it. So is there a need for solar PV data in the real estate transaction in Massachusetts? I think that answer is absolutely. What are the benefits of auto-populating that data? Well, I really think they run up and down the entire value chain of the transaction. Solar PV fields auto-pop by third-party verified sources would be, just a huge benefit to consumers, to buyers that are looking for that information, and to sellers that have made the investment to put that solar PV installation on their rooftop. It certainly would be a benefit to listing agents. Ben noted this earlier, and I think it's absolutely true, that I think it's very fair to say that many agents just don't have the necessary knowledge and confidence with this issue, solar PV, and adding it to their multiple listing services. I think third-party verified sources for that data would certainly lower the risk of liability for listing agents entering the information manually. And certainly for appraisers that are looking for this information for post-owned solar PV, appraisers are trying to find out when it was installed, what the size of the system is, what the capacity is, something that we only have an opportunity to add in our remarks, and many real estate agents just aren't adding the information that appraisers need to get this right. So in my mind, there's no question that up and down the value chain here, solar PV auto-pop would provide huge benefit. A few notes just about our state's largest MLS, which was a stakeholder and participant in the discussions that we had, which is MLS PIN, Property Information Network. It's a very large MLS, both in footprint and transactional volume. They're unusual, and we have 700 MLSs in the U.S. now. They're one of the handful of MLSs that actually manage their own database in-house as opposed to having a third-party vendor. They're very responsive to stakeholder input, which is terrific from my perspective, and I think that's really due to the fact that they have an outstanding CEO and president in Kathy Condon, who's always been responsive to input about green data fields and how they reflect our market here in Massachusetts. And I'll talk more about those connections a little bit later, but very lucky to have MLS PIN as our largest MLS in the state. And with that, I'll hand it off to Laura Parsons.
Thanks, Craig. This is Laura Parsons at the Center for Sustainable Energy. We were looking in the San Diego region at potential for this auto-pop type system, and we're actually the administrators of the California Solar Initiative in the San Diego region, so we were already pretty familiar with the inventory of solar homes, but in terms of how others could approach it in other geographies, in California, the Public Utilities Commission actually publishes at the zip code level information about every system that has been installed either through the California Solar Initiative or simply just through an interconnection agreement with, meaning any system that's tied into the grid. So that data is available to download to the public if one wanted to look at the solar inventories in another part of the state. Certainly, San Diego is a pretty advanced solar market, relatively speaking. You can see that graph on the right side of that slide. This is due in large part to that CSI, California Solar Initiative, decade-long incentive program, as well as the rapid development of PACE financing, and certainly the advent of the third-party owned financing models, the leases and the power purchase agreements all really helped that growth happen in the San Diego region and beyond. In terms of implementation opportunities, there is one MLS for San Diego County, and we were fortunate to already have some relationships because we've been working on behalf of our local government partnership to work with the realtor community and work towards adding more fields into the MLS related to all sorts of energy and water efficiency types of data points. So it is good it is a long-term process to build those relationships if you don't have them already, but to understand how the MLS is governed. Here in San Diego, they're governed by the 3 local associations of realtors, and what their decision-making process is to potentially implementing those RESO standard solar fields ahead of the deadline or at all, and things like that. And the last thing I'll mention, kind of echoing some of what Craig was saying, is that in our discussions with the local realtor associations and other related stakeholders over the years, we've certainly heard realtors express some stress over the transfer process related to third-party owned systems. So, transferring that lease from the home seller to the home buyer, as well as PACE loans. And certainly having that data flagged in the MLS listing has the potential to alleviate some of that stress, because it prompts the conversation to happen much earlier in the process, as opposed to being a surprise that comes later in the process, which could happen for, if the buyer's agent is not particularly well versed in these types of matters and didn't think to ask because nothing was mentioned. And overall, the concept of auto-populating data, as Craig mentioned, can definitely help alleviate some of the risk associated with manual entry, and that's certainly something that resonates here locally in the San Diego area as well. So I will stop there and turn it back to Laura.
Actually, this is where I jump in. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Laura and Craig. So this landscape assessment, Laura and Craig both sort of talk about it so naturally. Obviously, they're very knowledgeable about their local community, but even and what goes on in their local community in terms of the real estate listing, ultimately sale process. But just pulling in the right information to conduct this landscape assessment was time, even in those communities where they were very familiar with. But and so the kinds of information they obviously wanted to collect were information about the current listing process. How are even solar homes listed? What is the landscape for the solar installers, the number of solar homes, but also who is installing them in the state or in their particular geography. Who are the aggregators that are currently auto-populating data to the MLS? These are all really important questions that need to be understood before you can kind of move ahead with an appropriate way to get solar data into the MLS. And Craig and Laura did that because they were already very familiar with it. But we lay out these questions in the roadmap for folks to consider in their local context so that they might be able to pick the appropriate pathway of how to get solar into their local marketplaces. So Laura Stuckel talked about the solar data assessment. Laura Parsons and Craig talked about the landscape assessment. I'm going to talk about the data access assessment. And I should tell you that at the beginning of this process of the roadmap, we didn't think we'd need this section. There is a public-private paradox for solar data that really, I think, was one of the biggest surprises of doing this work. Solar, of course, is not secret. You can Google a home and see the solar panels on the roof. You can drive by the home. Often, if the roof is the southern-facing roof is facing the road, you can see the solar panel. These are big pieces of equipment that are installed on their home, and obviously, therefore, they are not private. Similarly, characteristics about homes are public information. You can look up on Trulia and Zillow and Realtor.com about the home in your neighborhood that might not even be selling, and there will be information there about those characteristics. So having a solar system didn't seem to be that difficult to determine. To declare was public information. and therefore should be accessible. Similarly, a permit is usually pulled for a solar installation. There might be a UCC filing. I'll talk a little bit about these data sets in a moment. But there's aspects of the installation process that are obviously public, and those data are public. So that's where we started in on this process, thinking, well, it's just so simple. Data for solar systems should be public, and therefore those aggregators that are currently holding those data record holders, should hand it over because it's already public. But of course, what we found out was that is not going to happen. It's not going to happen easily. And one of the main reasons why is because there are lots of laws in place that govern the control of those data. Even though the existence of the solar system might be, for instance, not something that they can hide, the actual data that declares that this system is there and the size of the system and when it was installed are held by entities that are restricted from sharing that. So it's those laws and regulations that exist that keep them from being able to do this. So Laura Parsons mentioned in California, there are hundreds of thousands of systems. CPUC collects data, which is the California Public Utilities Commission, collects data on those systems as they go through the interconnection process. And so they have all the addresses, but the utilities are the keepers of those data, and they're not required by the law to share it. In fact, they are required, when they do share information at the system level, to redact the address. So if you go to CPU's website, you can download information on every system in California that went through the interconnection process, but not one of them has an address attached to it. So this is the paradox that we realize, and so we realize as well that we're going to need to come up with ways to access those data. And the hope is that this is where we are currently, and that over time, maybe individuals or entities that hold those data will become more and more comfortable, or the laws and regulations will change to allow them to be comfortable with sharing those data. Because we do believe there's no real secret, there's no reason to be secret here, but obviously the laws and regulations govern the release of this data. So where did we look for these pieces of data that Laura mentioned, Laura Stuckel mentioned that are part of the RESO standard? We want to find the address of the home. We want to find the size of the system, when it was installed, and the ownership of that system, and maybe ideally the estimated or actual output of that system. Well, there's no one source of data that has all of that information that is publicly available. That's the paradox, right? So we can't just simply go here, get that data, and hand it off. We have to potentially pull that data in from a variety of sources and maybe accumulate it together, or find a way to get it from an individual source that might not necessarily have all the pieces that we need. So, as I mentioned, and so did Laura and others, permit data is a great source of information. We know that permits are filed, and that public permit data is public. There are aggregators in the United States now pulling that information together across the nation or across big geographies. And so that's a great piece of data, but often that would just have that this home might have solar, or that a permit was taken out for that system. It might not actually tell you that the system was installed. You might have a date sort of that applies to where around when the system was likely installed, but you don't know for sure that it was installed on a particular date, often for the permit. And you don't know other pieces of information, the size of the system, who might own that system, those sorts of things which are key. In the case of UCC filing, this is an interesting piece of data. Again, it's public, but it's not particularly easy to get. There are aggregators that generally pull this information in, but they generally charge a fee to get these data. It would need a lot of work to get them to hand over all of this information. And generally they collect it from sort of in PDF form, and then scrape information off the PDF, hopefully to categorize it correctly. And so UCC filings come into play when systems are not owned by the homeowner, or there's some sort of security interest in that system if it is owned by the homeowner, for instance, for where there might be a solar loan. And those filings just simply establish the fact that there is a security interest in that system, and therefore that security interest needs to be resolved before that system transfers. That would tell you that the system might be owned not by the homeowner but by a third party, for instance. And you might have some idea about date range, but you don't have size of the system and you don't have output or anything like that. In the interconnection process and also for the incentive processes, often there's really high-quality data collected. We have obviously the size of the system. We have often the year it was installed and interconnected, and maybe when incentives were paid out. We have the ownership information often declared, but not always. We have maybe some information about the expected output of that system at the time of those applications. And so that's really good data, but this is really difficult data to get at this point. There's only a few examples around the country where that data is public. Financing data and installer data are both really obviously private data that is held by private entities that finance the system or install the system. But if aggregated together and if there's means to share it, they could be great sources of data. The cool thing about financing data, for instance, is there's an interest in knowing how those systems perform. And so therefore, the output of that system on a year basis, for instance, is usually collected as part of that going forward. And so if access to those data are possible, one might be able to get that estimated or actual output information that might not be possible otherwise. So those are some sources of data. I mentioned that kind of from top to bottom, they're arrayed with sort of easiest to get to hardest to get to potentially because of the laws that govern sharing and I guess the customs of sharing those data. And so what we also include in the roadmap are a set of what we call accelerators to maybe gain access to those data. Now, this starts with the fact that you've tried to figure out how you can get these data and you failed, and you want to come up with other ways to get the data, or you want to set up a system in the local community where access would be much easier in the future. So without giving a ton of detail, obviously we can't be thinking about each local situation. We provide 6 scenarios where data might be accessible, either historical data or future data. So one might be opt-in or opt-out campaigns for various stakeholders, maybe through the application process, through the interconnection, or through the installer application or incentive program application. The data could be potentially accessed by allowing people to either opt in or opt out of that sharing agreement. Similarly, you could have consent clauses as part of some of the contracts that are signed, many contracts that are signed through the process that allow those data to be shared after the fact. There could be draft legislation, sort of wholesale change at the state or local level that allows data to be shared. Potentially, if one can come up with a really good argument for why these data should be public, one could consider a public records request. As I said, it's been a paradox, but often what governs, well, in some cases what governs sharing this data is an opinion of privacy rather than a clear definition of privacy. And maybe through those, where there's a little bit of gray area, a public records request could be possible. Theoretically, moving to the 5th bullet, you could have a change in the best practices of the local government. So, for instance, when a permit is filed, other information is collected, and that information is standardized in some way so that access to that data would allow more information to be offered at that time. And the same could be true through PACE financing procedures or things like that. And finally, we recognize that maybe you just can't get all the data from any one place, yet you might be able to get some pieces of data through public sources currently, but you can't. So come up with an idea to maybe mash them up to something called a matching procedure. I'm actually blanking on the name. I know others on the phone call are thinking of it. Propensity matching or probabilistic matching procedure that allows one to potentially match different data sources and give you high confidence that those data are the same home, and therefore you're sharing more pieces of information that come from multiple sources. So those are sort of some of the ideas to deal with the fact that we've got this disaggregated set of data that has various forms of privacy governing their release. Let's see here. I'm going to stop here, and then this sort of gets us into the last section of the roadmap, and then there's a few more points after that. Just see, Deborah, if there are any questions we should immediately answer.
Yeah, a couple questions in regards to Massachusetts. There's a question around how many residential installations that was to get to 16 megawatts, and that's a little under 40,000. But then there's a follow-up question asking if we know the ratio of homeowner versus third-party owners on that rooftop solar for the just a little under 40,000 homes.
Thanks, Deborah. Those great questions. It was 1,600 megawatts of installed solar PV that we reached in 2016, not 16, so substantial amount. The last numbers that I saw from Massachusetts Clean Energy Center was in September of last year, and at that point we had 56,000 homes with solar PV on them, growing at a rate of 1,500 to 2,000 a month. So I'm guessing that we're over 60,000 at this point.
Great, thank you.
And any idea, Craig, of the percentage of homeowner-owned versus third-party owned?
Leased versus, I'm not clear on that. I don't have a specific number on that. My gut says from the market is that we're moving gradually more towards host-owned solar PV rather than third-party owned solar PV. That is a gut reaction to what I see in the marketplace and the questions that I'm asked from consumers and seeing listings pop up in the multiple listing service. One question we need to cover is what is, oh, go ahead, Ben, sorry.
No, please, go ahead.
Yeah, so what is an MLS was a question I saw as well. And we'll just hit that briefly. I mean, I'm so sorry that we didn't cover that earlier because many of us are involved in the real estate transactions and we just use these acronyms thinking everybody understands them. But the MLS is the multiple listing service. It's really the central nervous system of the entire real estate transaction. It starts when if I list your home, put it on the market, I take pictures, take all kinds of information about your home when we meet. I go back to my office and open up the MLS, the local MLS, and I start to enter information into the MLS about your home, pictures, data fields, remarks. When we publish that, that's where it goes every place. What you see on Trulia, on Zillow, on Realtor.com, all of that information started with the listing agent entering information about the property. Everybody uses it. Obviously the real estate agents, the consumers, the buyer's agents, the appraisers, the bank underwriters, all are using the information that was entered by the listing agent, which again is why it's so important that auto-population is a big solution for some of the errors that we're seeing with this issue in particular.
Great. Thanks for that answer, Craig, and great questions. And I see a bunch of questions are coming in. We do have a few more slides we want to get through here. So why don't we hold off for the time being, Deborah, and we'll get to this at the end. So obviously, if we're going to have implementation of PV Auto-Pop, we're going to need to think about how that can actually occur. And so given the fact that we had these three target geographies or focus geographies we were focusing on, and had gone through the various steps that we say folks should do in their local community, the last one is sort of pick a way that you might see this happening. We had to pick it for these communities too. But it should be clear that this is all hypothetical at this point, that we're going to lay out three different pathways that we envision, and it's unclear because this hasn't happened yet as to which one makes sense in local communities and exactly how this is going to happen. So I'm going to turn it over now back to Craig. I think Craig's first, and then we've got Laura Parsons and Laura Stukel to describe the three pathways that we envision. And there might be a fourth that we haven't even considered, or some amalgamation of these next three that will actually happen in your local context. And then they're going to turn it back over to me, and then we're going to just cover a few more slides and turn to question and answers. So with that, I'll advance the slide, Craig, and you're up for talking about Massachusetts and a possible a pathway that we consider might be conceivable there, but obviously we're not very close there.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Yeah, just reinforcing that. These are all kind of hypothetical opportunities. We haven't explored any kind of implementation in Massachusetts. This was just out of stakeholder discussion about what might be possible, what could be possible. And one of the things I discovered in this project is that our region is very unique. Massachusetts is very unique. It's unique because, let's face it, we have the New England Patriots, so that's number one thing, right? We're leading the nation in football. But our region is unique in terms of this issue because we have a very large MLS in our state that maintains its own database. That is really unusual. Of the 700 MLSs, there may be only 4 or 5 that actually do that. So the great opportunity for me was I had direct access to the people that were involved daily with maintaining that database and getting their input, which was just hugely beneficial. We also have a tax aggregator, so that middle green circle that you see. Our tax aggregator in our state is the Warren Group, and they have an auto-pop mechanism already in place with our largest MLS in the state, with MLS PIN. Transactional data from the Registry of Deeds is updated to Warren Group, and then they update it to MLS PIN on a weekly basis. So when I take a listing at 123 Main Street, Melrose, if there's an address match with that, there's auto-population from tax records that already occurs and is updated on a regular basis. So that's a huge benefit as well to our region. We've already got that relationship in place between the tax aggregator and the MLS. And then we're also very fortunate to have the Mass Clean Energy Center in our state as well. They collect all of the data from, or most of the data from solar PV installations across the state in their production tracking system. So I think we're unique in that we have really 3 central players that really cover the footprint of the state. That's very unusual. I think, generally speaking, all of those players understand the importance of the data in the residential transaction. That doesn't mean that there wouldn't be challenges, as Ben has pointed out, of releasing the solar PV data, or how licensing agreements would work between the parties involved with this. There would be a lot of heavy lifting involved for everybody involved with this if we were to explore actual implementation of solar PV auto-pop in our state, where we have some players that could possibly make this happen. And with that, I'd just like to thank MLS PIN, Warren Group, and certainly Mass Clean Energy Center for being stakeholders in this and helping us understand what the challenges would be and the benefits would be for producing something like this. So with that, I'll hand it over to Laura Parsons for San Diego.
Thank you, Craig. So another potential pathway is this concept of a solar industry collaborative repository pathway. And this basically comes from the fact that the solar industry, whether it's installers or lenders who are financing these projects, have some really high quality data about these systems that they're already collecting and tracking. And so, what if we could, again, as Craig said, hypothetically, we have not substantially started down this path, but what if we could form an industry collaborative to pool that data and make it available to an MLS? And this could happen at a national scale or a state scale. There's nothing that kind of ties this to a specific geography, but because San Diego is a fairly mature solar market and there's a lot of activity going on here, it could potentially be a good place for a pilot version of this type of repository.
Next is Laura Stuckel. She's going to pinch hit for Colorado.
Yes. So Colorado Energy Office was good enough we reached out to them as these different concepts were emerging. There's been some work happening in the real estate space for a number of years that they've been building on, and they're starting to look at what that looks like for solar. So we were thrilled to bring them in kind of at the last minute, and I'm pleased to be able to represent the notes we took from them and the concept that kind of bubbled up based on their experience. So, and Lindsay Stegall from the Colorado Energy Office is on the line, so we appreciate her being here, and she might be able to pop in through the chat function later if there's questions about this in more detail. But the example in Colorado is kind of this idea of the publicly funded repository that started to emerge. And so now you're starting to get the idea of how there's different possible pathways kind of depending on what that landscape assessment looks like, what the data assessment looks like. So in Colorado, a couple key things to understand their situation. The Colorado Energy Office has been layering grants over the past couple of years. Like I said, they've been really building up a real estate initiative. And so the journey leader in that case are already kind of taking on that role, perhaps a little bit more in energy efficiency over the years, but emerging into the solar space. So you have a state agency kind of serving in that journey leader role, and as they've been looking at the idea of getting energy efficiency data and solar data, they have relationships with the varying permitting offices across the state, and it numbers in the hundreds, but they do have, some cases stronger relationships, but, what they recognize is on the real estate side, there's about 18 MLSs that cover the state of Colorado. Over the years, they've developed good relationships with them, in particular with the biggest two in the Boulder area and the Denver, Colorado area. And so it started to emerge that they knew where the data was, and they knew that the target was about 18, which wasn't quite so overwhelming. And so what started to emerge was this idea of, is it possible to use public funds to build a repository so that permit data could come in, even though maybe it's 200 jurisdictions? Could it come into a public repository where it could all be standardized, cleaned up, and then could be mapped to those 18 different MLSs and auto-populated that way? And so that's what you see reflected here, is that idea of possibly some of that public data coming into a repository that's, at least in the way of Colorado, they're starting to do the legwork, but also looking at that business model for how they could help it exist without possibly being so directly involved in maintaining it. And then the idea that from that repository, it could go to the tax aggregators that serve the MLS in the state, or there's some MLSs that might want to take that data themselves directly. So again, a third option. Something else that I will throw out is that there is another project emerging in the Northeast. It's called HELIX, the Home Energy Information Labeling Exchange, HELIX. I know we have a couple folks from the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnership that are on the line, and that's a multi-state effort in the Northeast, again, looking at energy efficiency, but possibly being able to extend into the solar space. So that's another example we see of this publicly funded repository popping up. So all three of these, we have some great examples of the story of kind of how these three different areas got to thinking about these concepts. And I'll transition now to Ben, and you can wrap up and talk about how we might hopefully start to see some of these things emerge as actual implementation projects in the not-so-distant future.
Thanks, Laura. We had in the presentation a spot to allow the authors to talk a little bit about their situation. We've been able to do so already, so we're going to skip this section and sort of deal with questions that have come in. There's now a growing number at the end, and hopefully we can, if need be, address some of the individual author surprises and what they took out of the process. So as you know, the roadmap is directed at others that can be journey leaders or navigators that would allow them to assess the local situation and potentially come up with an idea for how to do this. And so to do so, we had these journey leader exercises or traveler exercises that are super important to conduct. And we've talked about them as we've been going through the presentation today. Well, obviously they're part of the roadmap. And so there are a number of ways to get at these, and it's just great questions to be asking if you're interested in kind of thinking about this at your local level. And you can do so directly within the roadmap. It's 90 pages, not particularly convenient to do that, but at the landing page where the report will be housed, and I sent that link out right at the beginning of the presentation, and we'll mention it at the end too, there's just a smaller packet of just the journey leader exercises which can be downloaded. These are all fillable fields right inside the PDF, so you can work right inside there, very easy to work with. And so I'm just kind of noting that if you want to chart your own roadmap. And along those lines, we haven't given up kind of hoping to see implementation occur. The DOE has very generously funded us for continued work in this area in focus geographies where we've already done some work or where we think there's great potential. Hopefully we'll get some success in one of these locations, but who knows. And so those locations are Massachusetts, San Diego, as we've already mentioned, and Colorado, but also include an area in Southern California that's already done some great work, and Vermont. So just kind of stay in tune. We'll obviously be telling folks about these as we get through the end of this year. We will be building case studies for these areas, and hopefully we'll have some really good news. Obviously, we'll be thinking about the 3 pathways and how they fit within them. So let's see here. I'm just going to just remind you again how to ask questions. You can do so with the chat button. Lots of people already have, and so that's how you're going to do it. Find it in the lower left corner, click on it, and then put your information, your question right into the chat box, and we're monitoring it now. And let's see here. So if you haven't already gotten the report, and you'd like to, I think at this point you can just Google Capturing the Sun, Berkeley Lab, and you'll get a hit to the landing page. On that landing page is the full roadmap. There's also these journey leader exercises, which I mentioned. There's also a 2-page summary. This roadmap is very long, and so we went to the effort of trying to condense it into one simple, easy-to-read 2-page summary that you can hand to others and hopefully get them excited to dig into the deeper aspects of it. As well, this presentation will be, the PowerPoint will be there, and we are recording today, so hopefully we'll have the final presentation recording as well available for you to download and listen to if you want to. So I think at this point, let's see here. Just want to note that in the back of this presentation we have everybody's contact information. Obviously, feel free to reach out to us after this presentation if you'd like to. I'm going to click back to this slide and turn it over to Deborah to feed us some questions. Why doesn't the entire panel, if you haven't already, unmute yourself, and we can see if we can answer these. At this point, we have 13 questions that we have 18 minutes, so let's try to be pretty quick with our answers if we can so we can get through as many as possible.
Great, thanks, Ben. So the first question is, does the roadmap include energy efficiency upgrades? And Laura, you touched a little bit on HIA and some of the partners related to that, so maybe you can take a quick stab.
Sure. I would just say, we have some great folks on the line. There's some people that are members of Council of MLS. And RISO, we appreciate you guys being part of the process. And what we found is that the MLS is the MLS and the real estate community are very interested in this. information that gets auto-popped is more accurate. It's easier to find. Appraisers see that value proposition as well. So what's good for solar is also good for energy efficiency. The privacy level of energy efficiency information tends to be that much more private. And so it might just take a little while, but certainly what's happening with this could be applied to energy efficiency as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Laura. So we have another question about the large number of MLSs, almost 800 of them, and a question about how we're going to make this work if there's so many MLSs covering the United States.
I can take that one too, and then maybe someone else wants to jump in. But I think the ideas that we were looking at could cover multiple jurisdictions as once. So the solar installer repository is really exciting because potentially you could have a national database. So the solar industry could come together, figure out how you participate, what data goes in, what those participants get out of it, and then that could go to all 800 of those MLSs could subscribe to it. It could be sent to Zillow. We have a whole section on Realtor.com and Zillow and those national portals. So there potentially you have national coverage. And like the public repositories and what's happening starting to emerge in Colorado in the Northeast, I'll go back to the Colorado example. You have one public repository. In that case, that could feed 18 MLSs in the state. And so the repositories we really found were central for organizing the data, but also because it creates scale.
And Laura, will you remind those on the line that I know that the largest MLSs cover a large amount of the United States. Will you give that rough number again?
I think it's the top 100 covers about 40% of the country. And so, yes, that's a good point, is that in the work that we've done at Elevate Energy, we tend to focus at that top 100 because of the capabilities that they have and then also the coverage. And Jeremy or Betsy or someone on the line, clarify if I've got my fact wrong. But the top 100 for sure, probably the top 200 are much bigger in scale than the others, the lower 600 or so.
Great, thank you. We have another question about. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Ben. I just wanted to add that one thing that's helpful in thinking about where this makes sense to occur is where there is lots of solar installation, where there are lots of solar installations occurring too. And so this doesn't make any sense if you're in a state, for instance, that has no policy in place to connect systems to solar homes or no incentive program, and there are states like that. Now, solar might be installed in those states, but it's not something that the real appraisers are running into very often, and therefore maybe it doesn't rise to the level of importance that it does in other places, for instance, where you have 20 or a growing number of density. So if you think about 700 MLSs, it gets very scary, but hopefully there are tools and ways to think about it that can limit it down to either the top 100 or market areas where we see lots of solar installed.
Wonderful, thanks. Another question around, is there a list already of these information aggregators? Because I know that you threw out a few different names.
We've got some listed in the roadmap. There are relatively big ones, CoreLogic, Black Knight, CRS Data are three I know that I'm aware of. Laura, you might mention some others as well, and then if there is a list. Yeah,
Warren Group is an example. There's some regional players. Ben, I think on that one we do have a pretty good list in a couple different categories. And then I see Mark Springfield is here from Hot for Solar, so we'll give him a shout out. But some of those niche players in the more permitting or solar area, but definitely consult the roadmap, and we've got a starter list of how to find them there.
Great, thanks. And I would also add that that's one of the activities in the roadmap is to find out this information. So if you don't know right off the bat, you're not far behind. You just are going to have a little bit of work to do when you're getting to those activities.
Yeah, and maybe what we'll do is we'll try to get that particular question or the table that and where it is in the roadmap to discuss. I'm sort of leafing through trying to find it right now, but I will do so and we'll send that on to you.
Great, thanks. We have another question is there any technology for a homeowner to do an end run around the utility and allow the property owners to get their own solar output and utility use data?
That's a very technical question. The assumption is that you don't currently have data available to you, even though you have a system on your home, and that is something you should talk to your installer about. In some cases, you can get that information through a web portal, but I can't really, there's no way to say for sure that that's possible in lots of scenarios, but sorry, I can't help you out on that one. Anyone else have any comments on that one?
The solar industry repository would be a jumpstart in that space. Again, assuming that the industry was interested in pursuing that. And then also the Green Button Initiative, which is allows utility companies or consumers to share, to select providers that they can share their utility information. So perhaps in the future, it's not something that would happen overnight, but that might be a model where solar information that's owned by a utility could also be designated as shareable, and then you could pick your MLS as a destination that it would be approved sharing. But that's a concept in and my fourth grader's home. I'm going to put myself on mute for a second. Sorry.
And I would add to that in terms of getting an estimate for PV production. There is a website, pvwatts.com, that can be useful, that I've utilized before to get a sense of what to expect from production if the system's running at full capacity.
Yep, and the last thing I'll add to here, because I see, just shout out to James Finley for joining. Thank you so much. That's a great question. Also, in terms of is there access to utility data? There is an initiative called the Green Button Initiative, which is hoping to allow folks to have information about their utility use available and shareable, and that is in various stages around the country. In some places, for instance, Chicago, that information can be connected right to the listing. In other places, it's not available, so it's everything in between.
And Orange Button, Ben, correct me if I'm wrong, is kind of doing the same thing from a solar perspective.
The idea, yep. Orange Button is very much focused at this point on kind of understanding the use cases of solar data across a variety of different segments of the value chain for systems, both from the point of processing a potential system out to keeping that system up and operational for many years. And once the use cases have been defined, that work has ended, and now we're moving into thinking about the structure of those data, how those data should be appropriately characterized, how much overlap there is between the use cases, and ultimately building a mock data set that would allow those data to be stored. During that process, there's a lot of thinking in terms of how do we take this DOE-funded project to develop the schema for these data into the market and ultimately allow it to be self-sustaining. And these data are particularly useful for those that are in the finance world that finance these systems, because obviously they, as I mentioned, they want to know that they're operating correctly for a long period of time, and keep an eye on that sort of thing as well, be able to share data across individuals involved in those, so that could be an insurance individual, a firm, or a firm that's in charge of operation and maintenance, that sort of thing. So if you want to Google Orange Button, you can find out a lot more about that project. Obviously there's some overlap between that project and what we're doing here.
Great, thanks. Another couple questions around potentially using this process in other use cases. So there's a question as to whether or not you would be able to auto-populate data for renters, particularly maybe if they had community solar, and then on the flip side, for commercial properties. And I don't know if that question asker was thinking, beyond the MLS, maybe in something like a CoStar, but in a couple of situations outside, it's just your straightforward single-family owned.
This is Laura. Let me just jump in and say that the multiple listing service, the bulk of it really is around sales and not rentals. So certainly if you open up the pipeline, you could also include rentals. And in the commercial space, there's fewer providers. So I think there's already some of that happening with benchmarking on the commercial side. So CoStar is taking in some benchmarking data. I can't comment on the structure of the commercial data. That might be something to look at, but certainly that would be feasible in those examples. I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything.
All right. Another question is if there's any examples of this type of auto-population happening in other areas, maybe even other countries.
You mean the auto-population of solar?
Correct.
Not that I'm aware of.
But auto-population in general in a multiple listing service, I think is, well, it's certainly common here in Massachusetts. I think it's fairly common across the United States. I think there is a mechanism there for, when I type 123 Main Street in with an address match, there'll be certain information that pops up. It's 7 rooms, 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths. It's heated by, natural gas. Some of the basic information that I need about the property it does already auto-populate with MLS PIN in Massachusetts.
And there is a section in the roadmap that highlights what Craig's talking about. So what kind of auto-pop happens today? You'll find a page or so about that. But that's a good question. I don't know about it anywhere else in the world. Hopefully we'll be the first.
Great, thanks all. We have a question around if leased PV contributes to a home's value.
So if Sandy were on the phone, she'd be the person to answer that, but I'll step in for her. Fannie Mae's given us very clear guidance that from an appraisal perspective, there's no allowed value for leased third-party owned solar PV if the home wants to be moved into the secondary mortgage market, which is 80% of homes in the United States. So the quick and easy answer from that from a Fannie Mae perspective is no. That doesn't mean that a buyer doesn't see value, particularly if there's a good power purchase agreement where there's a clear indication that the amount that they'll pay for the production of power is, 75% of what it would be for the utility rate. I think if that's explained correctly to a buyer, how that works in the power purchase agreement, they can certainly see value there. But in terms of value from an appraisal perspective, Fannie Mae is pretty clear on that.
Yeah, and as I mentioned early on in this presentation, the Berkeley Lab is doing some work in this area. We will have a report out in hopefully 30 days, allowing folks to know kind of the results of our analysis of this issue, which is how is the market responding to third-party owned homes with third-party owned systems on it. But obviously this question of whether it's appropriate to value as part of the appraisal process is a different one.
Wonderful, thank you. We have another question around what types of programs or processes are valuable for identifying systems by addresses?
This is for the mashup. Yeah, so the idea about the mashup really starts with having publicly available data to start with, and so lease data permit data is a great place to start with an idea of a matchup, maybe UCC filings as well, and then being able to link to publicly available data set that has information redacted, the address redacted. You might be able to have a mashup there to allow you to have access to a broader data set of homes. Was that what is there anything more, Deborah, that needed to be answered on that one?
Nope, I think that's great.
Ben, this is Laura Parsons. I'll just add that data quality and consistency is a big issue when looking at potentially mashing things up between multiple sources. So just something to keep in mind.
I will echo that, though. There are a couple lingering questions, and I know that we've touched on it a little bit with energy efficiency, but people seem to really want to know, could you add energy efficiency features here or even other types of renewables? So maybe the panel could just touch on, why the data for PV seems kind of right for this type of process, and maybe why it might be a little bit difficult for some of the others, and then also touch on the other types of renewables that might be appropriate here to auto-populate into an MLS.
So this is Laura. I think the sky's the limit. We want to think broadly. We started with solar because we do have some strong markets where you really need scale. The multiple listing service industry or their vendor, their tech vendor, whoever, someone's going to have to invest in the technology to import this data and make it accessible. So you have to have scale. So that's why solar, especially in the markets where it's stronger, kind of comes to the forefront first. With energy efficiency, it's definitely something that's of interest. But for example, if you share utility information, are you exposing a home that might be vacant in the off season or something like that? So there's some other unique characteristics, challenges, I should say, to the energy efficiency piece. But for sure, in the not so distant future, we hope that as much of this information can be auto-populated as possible. And we're definitely getting positive reception from the real estate industry, appraisers, MLSs, real estate agents to make that happen.
And you mentioned it already, Laura, but I just want to reinforce it. Up here in the Northeast, we have a project that's also DOE funded called Helix, Home Energy Labeling Information Exchange. And the idea of that is to create a data repository primarily for energy efficiency features, characteristics, HERS ratings, DOE home energy scores, green certifications for homes, and maybe solar PV as well, to create a central repository that could be used from New York to Maine for MLSs to be able to auto-populate that information. So that project is, this one started earlier. Helix is now on its way, so hopefully you'll all be tuning in on a webinar much like this one about that program as well, maybe a year from now.
I just want to jump in here. We're at the bottom of the hour, and that gets us out to 90 minutes for this webinar. I really appreciate everyone spending their valuable time listening to us. Hopefully you learned a little bit. You can take something away, and you're intrigued by the roadmap and want to delve into it deeper. Every one of our contact information is there on the screen. We're all in this constantly, so please feel free to reach out to any one of us if you want to ask additional questions. So with that, I'll leave it, and I think that's it. There was one question we'll try to answer offline. I appreciate you asking it. And thanks so much for your time today.